Welcome everyone to the due diligence training for the Bridges and Bridges Regional Treatment Center Rental Assistance Program. Next slide. First off, welcome and congratulations on being selected. My name is Ellie Miller and I'm the program manager for the Bridges program. And I'm joined today by Meredith Mayran. Meredith, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. My name is Meredith Mayran. I work on our business operations team here at the Multifamily Division of Minnesota Housing, and I'll be working with you through the due diligence and pre-contracting phase.
The agenda for today is to review the general due diligence and also the more program-specific due diligence. At the end, we will review the submission, how the submission works, and the important deadlines that need to be met. We'll leave room at the end for your specific questions. Next slide. The first section is the general due diligence section, and Meredith will review this section for you.
Thanks, Ellie. So I'll be reviewing the due diligence items that will be required for all of our grants. These include the grant contract agreement, a board resolution from your organization, proof of insurance in the form of a certificate of liability, and if you're a new grantee or if banking information has changed, an electronic funds transfer authorization form, W-9, and SWIFT vendor number. I'll describe each of these items in a little bit more detail. So the grant contract agreement was sent to you along with your selection letter and due diligence checklist. We would suggest that you review it in its entirety. I want to call your attention to just a couple of items, specifically Section 6 of the grant contract agreement, which lists your authorized representative. This is the main point of contact for any grant-related information, and it was taken from your application materials. If that person should be different, please let us know that when you submit your other due diligence items. That's, again, Section 6 of the grant contract agreement. The other item I would call your attention to in the grant contract agreement specifically is Exhibit B, which is the program summary. This also has contact information listed for your main contact as well as for your local mental health entity. Please review that to make sure that it's accurate, and if it needs to be adjusted, feel free to notify us when you submit your other due diligence items. I also want to go through just a couple other important things, specifically some dates that you'll want to pay attention to, the effective date, the grant period, and the expiration date. The effective date of this contract will either be July 1st, 2023, or when the contract is fully executed, whichever is later. The effective date is when all parties have executed the document, including your signers and ours, and it's the date when you can start incurring costs under the terms of the grant contract agreement. So any expenses incurred prior to the execution of the grant contract agreement by both parties cannot be reimbursed. The grant period is the effective date of the contract through June 30th, 2025. This is the time period in which the grant proceeds must be incurred and expended, so no funds can be used prior to or after this time. You'll also note that there's an expiration date on the contract of September 30th, 2025. This allows a few additional months to submit final reports and documents to us, for us to pay out any final adjustments, and for your organization to return any unexpended funds to Minnesota Housing should that be necessary. Before moving on to the board resolution, I will just note that the grant contract agreement was sent to you for a full review, but there's no need for you to route it internally to your signers. Once all of your due diligence items have been submitted and approved, we will initiate signing via DocuSign. So we will also need the name, contact information, email address, and routing order, if applicable, of your authorized signers. Okay, moving on to the board resolution. We do require a board resolution from your organization's board of directors. It must be signed and dated an original board resolution and should be specific to the grant and include the awarded amount. It should also include the names of the individuals who are authorized to sign the grant contract agreement. Proof of insurance is a requirement of this grant, and it must be employee dishonesty or crime coverage in at least 1/8 the amount of the total grant award. I will note that employee theft coverage will not be accepted, so please make sure that you have the required coverage before submitting the documentation. We ask that you submit the proof of insurance as a certificate of liability, listing Minnesota Housing as a certificate holder, and the policy must be current with an expiration after the start of the grant term. Insurance typically brings up a good number of questions, so please feel free to reach out to us if you're working with your insurance agent and you have any questions in the process. And as I mentioned, if you're a new grantee or if you've had a change to your banking information, we ask that you submit electronic funds transfer forms allowing direct deposit of funds directly to your organization. The forms are linked here. They're also included in the due diligence checklist that was sent to you with your contract materials. There's either an authorization form for new grantees or a bank change form for existing grantees. If you've not yet registered as a vendor with the state of Minnesota, you'll need to complete that prior to receiving payment. Again, the link to register as a vendor is included and will be posted to the website, and you'll also want to submit a W-9 along with your SWIFT vendor number and EFT forms. I think that covers the main general due diligence items, so I'll hand it over to Ellie to go over more program-specific items now.
Thanks, Meredith. Let's go to the next slide. The agenda items in the program-specific section are the waiting list selection, which is not for the RTC grantees, just the Bridges grantees, the cooperative agreement, and the contact form. Next slide. Some things to consider when creating your waiting list selection plan. With the expansion of the definition of institution that took place last contract term to include correctional facilities, how will you shape your waiting list practices to accommodate new referrals? How can your waiting list practices be more responsive to people exiting institutions? Instead of having long wait lists, how can you work on having real-time referrals to the program? If you have a long wait list, how can you work with your board and legal advisors to shift to a shorter, more responsive waiting list format? If you currently have a long wait list, reach out to me and we can discuss your waiting list plan. The earlier you submit, the sooner feedback can be provided as needed. Next slide. Submit your waitlist selection plan by the due diligence submission deadline, along with other required items. If changes to your waitlist selection plan are required, you will be notified by Minnesota Housing staff no later than Tuesday, June 13th. A final version of the waitlist selection plan will be due back to Minnesota Housing by Tuesday, June 20th. Next slide. The cooperative agreement is the next item, and it was not required at the time of application to give you some extra time to revisit this document. There was an error that I made in the Bridges RFP webinar regarding the cooperative agreement. I stated that the cooperative agreement will not be due at the due diligence phase, but after the grant contract agreements are signed. This was incorrect. A draft of the cooperative agreement, unsigned, must be reviewed by Minnesota Housing staff and approved during the due diligence stage. A final signed copy must be submitted during the due diligence phase before the grant contract agreement can be executed. This is meant to be a working document with your partners to reflect how Bridges operates in your service area. We are asking that you identify the behavioral health providers, the housing stability service providers in this agreement, as well as resources identified in the area to provide services to Bridges participants. The agreement does not require signatures from these additional entities, but if they have specific roles in your agreement and you want to draft a section to outline those roles and have them signed and be held accountable under this agreement, we are not limiting your ability to do so. Also, as a reminder, if you are paying entities that are providing services or assistance, perhaps in a subcontract arrangement to cover the region, a formal contract would be needed for this arrangement. The cooperative agreement would not be the document to utilize. Next slide. The coordinated entry plan should also indicate the shift to high priority homeless population that occurred last contract round and the plan to refer eligible households. Contact me if you need assistance, as the earlier you submit, the sooner this information can be reviewed and feedback can be provided as needed. Next slide. Lastly, on the cooperative agreement, submit a draft, an executed copy of the cooperative agreement between the housing authority or the housing agency and the local mental health entity. If changes are required, you will be notified directly by Minnesota Housing staff no later than Tuesday, June 13th. And then we need a fully executed copy of the cooperative agreement due back by Tuesday, June 20th. Next slide. The last item in the program-specific due diligence is the contact form. The contact form is completed in the format that we provide for you. The first section includes 2 contacts that are required for grant-related communication. We need a contact for your local mental health partner. And lastly, we need a contact for people seeking access to the program. This will be shared on the Minnesota Housing website. Next slide. Please reach out to Meredith on general questions and to me on program-specific questions. The best way to contact is via email as we continue in a hybrid mode and work remotely most often. Meredith will now review the submission and deadline information specifically so that everyone is clear on the due dates.
Thanks, Ellie. You'll want to send all of the due diligence items to the mhfa.grants email address and include in the subject line the name of your project, such as Bridges or Bridges RTC, and then the name of your agency. It's ideal if all of your documents are also labeled with your name and what the due diligence item is. All of the general items can be submitted as a PDF, so that would be your board resolution, your certificate of liability, but program-specific items should be submitted in their original format. So that would be the contact forms, and then, of course, the cooperative agreements and waiting list selection plans. All of the due diligence items must be received and approved prior to the execution of the grant contract agreement. Reimbursement of expenses incurred prior to Minnesota Housing's execution of the contract agreement will not be allowed. All of the due diligence items must be submitted and received by 4:30 p.m. on Wednesday, June 7th. Please send any questions related to due diligence to mhfa.grants@state.mn.us. I will note that July 1st this year falls on a Saturday, so we want to have all the contracts routed, signed, and fully executed prior to that day. So ideally by June 30th. The sooner you submit your items, the sooner we can review, send back for any possible revisions, approve, and then route the contracts. So feel free to submit as early as possible, with the deadline being June 7th. And now we'll open up for any questions. Feel free to enter your questions into the chat or raise your hand and we can unmute you so that you can come off and speak your question to the group. It looks like one question came through regarding board resolutions. The person stated they will not be able to get the board resolution until June 13th. Is that a problem? If you can notify us in advance, such as this, that will be the date your board resolution is signed, we can make note of that. It still falls within the time period that we'll be able to execute the contract. So yes, that's not a problem as long as you give us a heads up to expect it a little bit later. Another question is just a clarification. For the cooperative agreement, you want an unsigned copy, correct? And that is correct. We're asking that you submit an unsigned copy of the cooperative agreement by June 7th. That will be reviewed internally by Minnesota Housing staff. If there's any feedback or revisions required, we'll let you know by June 13th so that you can get us the revised and signed version by June 20th, leaving enough time for the contract to be executed before July 1st. Ellie, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think you answered it well. Thank you, Meredith.
One more question is, will this PowerPoint be sent to attendees? And we can send it out in an email. It will also be posted to our website along with the recording so that you can access it at a later time if necessary, or if you'd like to share it with any colleagues. All right, I think that's all the questions so far. Please feel free to raise your hand if any other questions are coming up. Okay, we have one more that came through. When you talk a little more about RTC due diligence, I'm with White Earth Nation in the urban area. Ellie, do you want to take that?
So the RTC due diligence is the same as Bridges, except for a wait list plan is not needed, as you're taking referrals directly from the regional treatment centers. So if anybody received the RTC grant specifically, you do not need to come up with a wait list plan. If you're not specifically under an RTC grant and you're just receiving a Bridges grant, you will be required to have a plan for how you organize your wait list. That doesn't mean that if you're serving just the general Bridges population, that you can't take referrals from the regional treatment center, but it's just the specific grants that are RTC that aren't required to have a wait list. And if you have additional specific questions related to that, reach out to me directly and I can be clear about your specific program.
Thank you all for your questions so far. We still have some time, so we'll leave it open for a little bit longer so that you can continue to send those in. Looks like one more came through about direct deposit. If you already have direct deposits with MHFA, do you need to set up a new electronic funds transfer? No, if you already have that set with us, you shouldn't need to submit new information. If you have questions about what we have on file, you can reach out to us directly and I'll be able to work with our finance department to verify that we have the correct information. All right, I'm going to just take us back to slide with contact information so that you have that if you need to reach out to us. If you have program specific questions, you can always reach out to Ellie Miller. Her information is posted. If you have general due diligence questions, you can reach out to me directly or to the grants email. that you received your notifications from.
Thank you everyone for attending today. I think we'll go ahead and sign off, Meredith, if you're not seeing any other questions come in. And enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.